The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, and Elena pulled her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders as she sat against the cold stone wall of the Valencia Opera House. She had been sitting in this same spot for almost 3 years now, and most people who walked past her every evening had no idea she existed to them. She was just another homeless woman with a paper cup on the ground and tired eyes that looked at nothing in particular. But Elena had a secret that nobody knew a secret. She had buried so deep inside herself that sometimes even she forgot it was there. 30 years ago, she had walked through the golden doors of this very opera house, but not as someone begging for coins. She had walked through those doors as a singer. Her voice back then could make grown men cry and women close their eyes in pure wonder. Critics in Madrid had called her voice a gift from heaven, and newspapers had written about the young woman from a small village who was destined to become one of Spain's greatest performers. That was another lifetime ago. That was when she was still Elena Marquez, the rising star. Now she was just the old woman that rich people stepped around on their way to watch other singers perform on the stage that should have been hers. The opera house stood tall and proud behind her, with its beautiful architecture and bright lights that spilled onto the wet pavement. Every night around 7, the expensive cars would start arriving, and men in fine suits would help women in silk dresses step out onto the red carpet. They would laugh and talk about their dinner plans and which singer they were most excited to hear. None of them ever looked down. None of them ever saw her. And maybe that was for the best, because Elena was not sure she could handle being seen anymore. Her journey to this cold spot on the ground had started 15 years ago, when her mother got sick. Her mother had been everything to her, and the woman who had first discovered that her daughter had a special voice when Elena was just 6 years old. Her mother had heard her singing while washing dishes and had dropped a plate in shock. From that day forward, her mother had worked 3 jobs to pay for singing lessons and had sacrificed everything so that Elena could have a chance at a better life. And Elena had made good on that sacrifice. By the time she was 22, she was performing in small opera houses across Spain. By 25, she had been invited to sing in Madrid. By 28, she had a manager named Roberto who promised to make her an international star, but her mother never got to see her daughter reach the top. The cancer came fast and cruel, and within 6 months, Elena was standing beside a hospital bed holding her mother's hand as the machines went quiet. Something broke inside Elena that day. She tried to keep singing, but every note reminded her of her mother, and every performance felt hollow and empty. Her manager, Roberto, saw that she was struggling, and instead of helping her, he saw an opportunity. He convinced Elena to sign papers she did not fully understand, and slowly he took control of everything. Her money disappeared into accounts she could not access. Her bookings dried up because Roberto was telling venues she was unreliable. By the time Elena realized what was happening, it was too late. Roberto had taken everything and vanished to South America with her life savings. She was 34 years old with nothing, no money and no family and no manager and no bookings. The depression that followed was like falling into a dark hole with no bottom. She stopped eating properly and stopped taking care of herself and stopped believing that anything good could ever happen. Again, friends tried to help at first, but Elena pushed them all away. She was too ashamed to let anyone see what she had become. The woman who was supposed to fill concert halls across Europe could not even fill her refrigerator. She lost her apartment when she could no longer pay rent. Then she lost her storage unit where she kept her mother's photographs and her performance dresses and every memory of the life she used to have. For a while she stayed in shelters, but the noise and the crowds made her feel like she was suffocating. So she started sleeping outside, and somehow she always found herself drawn back to the opera house. It was like a moth being pulled toward a flame that had already burned it once. She would sit outside those golden doors and listen to the muffled sounds of music drifting through the walls. Sometimes she could hear a soprano hitting a high note or an orchestra building toward a crescendo, and she would close her eyes and pretend she was inside. Pretend she was the one on stage with the lights warm on her face and the audience holding their breath. Then the music would stop, and she would open her eyes and remember where she really was. Years passed slowly when you lived on the street. Every day felt the same, and every night was a battle against the cold and the hunger and the loneliness that never went away. Elena learned which restaurants threw out food at what times and which doorways offered the best shelter from the winds. She learned how to make herself small and invisible so that police would not bother her. She learned how to survive, but she forgot how to live. Her voice, which had once been her greatest gift, became something she was afraid of. She had not sung a single note in over 10 years. Sometimes, late at night, when she was sure nobody was around, she would hum a few bars of an old song. But even that felt dangerous, like opening a door to a room full of ghosts. What if her voice was gone forever? What if all those years of silence had stolen the only thing that had ever made her special? She was too afraid to find out, so she kept quiet and kept invisible and kept sitting outside the opera house night after night. The other homeless people in Valencia knew her as the quiet one. She rarely spoke and never asked for anything, and always shared whatever food she had with others who needed it more. They did not know about her past, and she never told them. What was the point of talking about a life that no longer existed? Elena was 52 years old now, and she had accepted that this was how her story would end, not on a stage with roses thrown at her feet, but on a cold sidewalk with a paper cup that rarely had more than a few coins. She had stopped hoping for anything better. Hope was a luxury she could not afford. The night everything changed started like any other night. The rain had finally stopped, and the autumn air was crisp and cold. Elena sat in her usual spot and watched the fancy cars pull up to the opera house. The night was different. There were more cars than usual, and more cameras, and more excitement in the air. She overheard two women talking about a charity gala and how all the important people in Valencia would be there. They were raising money for homeless shelters, which made Elena smile a little sadly. Rich people getting dressed up and drinking expensive champagne to help people like her. Irony was almost funny. She pulled her blanket tighter and prepared for another long night of being invisible. The doors of the opera house opened and closed as guests arrived, and each time a wave of warm air and beautiful music floated out to where she sat. It made her heart ache in a way that surprised her. After all these years, she thought she had numbed herself to that pain. But tonight something was different. Tonight the music seemed to reach inside her chest and grab hold of something she thought was dead. She found herself humming along with a melody she recognized from long ago. It was an aria she performed dozens of times in her old life. The notes came back to her like old friends, and for just a moment she forgot where she was. Then a group of young men burst through the doors, laughing loudly and spilling champagne on the steps. They were clearly drunk and clearly rich and clearly used to the world bending to their wishes. One of them spotted Elena and nudged his friend. She saw them pointing and whispering, and her stomach tightened with familiar shame. She knew what was coming. She had seen that look before, the look that said she was not a person but a problem. The look that said she did not belong anywhere near their beautiful evening. She lowered her eyes and tried to make herself smaller, but it was too late. They were walking toward her, and Elena had no idea that the next few minutes would change everything. She thought she knew about her life and her voice and her place in this world. The young men walked toward Elena with the confidence that only money and privilege can give. There were 4 of them, all wearing suits that probably cost more than Elena had seen in the past 5 years combined. Their shoes were shiny, and their watches caught the light from the opera house entrance, and their laughter was loud enough to make other guests turn and look. The one leading the group was tall, with slick back hair and a face that had never known real hardship. He stopped a few feet away from Elena and looked down at her the way someone might look at a stain on an expensive carpet. His friends gathered behind him still, chuckling and sipping from their champagne glasses. Elena kept her eyes on the ground and hoped they would get bored and walk away. Sometimes that worked. Sometimes rich people just wanted to stare for a moment and feel better about their own lives before moving on. But tonight was not one of those nights. The tall one crouched down so he was closer to her level, and the smell of expensive cologne mixed with alcohol washed over her. So he said in a voice dripping with fake friendliness, "What brings you to our little party tonight?" His friends laughed like this was the funniest thing they had ever heard. Elena said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was usually the safest response, but her silence seemed to annoy him. "Come on," he continued, louder now so that more people could hear. "We are having a charity event for people like you, and here you are, right at our doorstep." He spread his arms wide like he was presenting her to an audience, the perfect guest of honor. More laughter from his friends, and now a small crowd was starting to gather. Some people looked uncomfortable, and others looked curious, and a few were even pulling out their phones. Elena felt her face burning with shame. She wanted to disappear into the stone wall behind her. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. But she could not move, and she could not speak, and she could not do anything except sit there while this stranger made a spectacle of her pain. One of the other young men stepped forward and dropped a coin into her paper cup with an exaggerated motion. "There you go," he said loudly. "Now you can buy yourself something nice." Tall one was not done though. He seemed to be enjoying the attention too much to stop. "Now wait," he said, holding up his hand. "I have a better idea." Turned to the growing crowd with a showman's smile. "This is an opera house, right? And we paid good money to hear people sing tonight." He turned back to Elena with a cruel glint in his eyes. "So why don't you sing for us and earn your dinner properly?" The crowd went quiet for a moment. Few people shifted uncomfortably, and one older woman in a fur coat shook her head and walked back inside. But nobody stepped forward to help. Nobody told him to stop. Elena felt tears building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "I don't sing," she whispered so quietly that only he could hear. What was that he said, leaning in dramatically and cupping his ear? "I couldn't hear you." His friends were practically howling with laughter. "Now I said I don't sing," Elena repeated a little louder. The tall one stood up and turned to the crowd with mock disappointment. "She says she doesn't sing," he announced. "Can you believe it?" Looked back down at her with a smirk. "Everyone can sing. Come on, just one little song, and maybe we will fill up that cup of yours." Something shifted inside Elena in that moment. It was small at first, like a tiny flame flickering to life in a room that had been dark for years. She thought about her mother, who had worked so hard to give her a chance. She thought about all those nights on stage when her voice had moved people to tears. She thought about the girl she used to be before Roberto and the depression, and the streets had taken everything away. That girl was still in there somewhere, buried deep but not gone, not completely. Elena looked up and met the tall man's eyes for the first time. There was something in her gaze that made his smirk falter just slightly, a flash of something he did not expect to see in a homeless woman. "Dignity. If I sing," she said slowly, "will you leave me alone?" The tall one recovered his composure and grinned at his friends. "You heard her, boys. She is going to sing for you." Stepped back and gestured grandly, like he was introducing a performer. "The stage is yours, sweetheart." A few more people had gathered now, and Elena could see the phone screens pointed at her like dozens of tiny eyes. Heart was pounding so hard, she could feel it in her throat. What was she doing? She had not sung in over 10 years. Her voice was probably destroyed from years of cold nights and cigarettes and not taking care of herself. This was going to be a disaster. This was going to be the final humiliation in a life full of humiliations. But something kept her moving. Some force she did not understand pushed her to plant her hands on the cold ground and slowly rise to her feet. Her knees ached, and her back was stiff, and she had to steady herself against the wall for a moment. Crowd watched in silence. Even the young men had stopped laughing. Elena stood therein, her stained coat and worn-out shoes, with her gray hair falling around her weathered face. She looked nothing like a performer. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. And maybe that was why she was able to do what she did next. She closed her eyes and took a breath, not the shallow, nervous breaths she had been taking, but a real breath from deep in her belly. The kind of breath her first voice teacher had taught her when she was just a teenager with dreams too big for her small village. She felt the cold air fill her lungs, and for a moment, she was not standing outside an opera house being mocked by strangers. She was backstage waiting for her cue. She was young and full of hope, and her mother was somewhere in the audience, waiting to hear her daughter fly. The memory was so vivid it made her chest ache. She let the breath out slowly, and then she opened her mouth. The first note that came out was shaky and uncertain, like a bird trying to remember how to use its wings. A few people in the crowd shifted, and Elena heard someone whisper something that might have been pity or might have been mockery, but she did not stop. She pushed through the fear and the doubt and the years of silence, and she reached for the note again. This time it was stronger. This time it had a hint of the power that used to bring audiences to their feet. She was singing "Oh mio babbino caro," one of the most beautiful arias ever written. It was the song her mother had loved most, and the song Elena had sung at her last professional performance before everything fell apart. The words came back to her, like they had been waiting all these years, waiting for her to be brave enough to let them out again. Her voice cracked on a high note, and she saw the tall man smirk at his friends, but she kept going. She kept pushing, and somewhere around the middle of the aria, something magical happened. The cracks started to smooth out, and the shakiness started to fade. And the voice that emerged was not perfect, but it was real. It was raw and emotional and filled with every ounce of pain and longing and hope that Elena had been carrying inside her for 15 years. The plaza went completely silent, not the uncomfortable silence from before, but something deeper, something almost sacred. People stopped walking and stopped talking and stopped everything just to listen. The tall man who had started all this was staring at Elena with his mouth slightly open, his champagne glass hung forgotten at his side. His friends had the same expression, like they were witnessing something they could not quite understand. Elena did not see any of them. Her eyes were still closed, and she was somewhere else entirely. She was with her mother, and she was on stage, and she was the person she used to be before the world broke her down. The final note hung in the cold night air like a prayer, and then there was silence. Complete and total silence. Elena opened her eyes, and for a moment, she did not know where she was. Then reality came rushing back. The opera house and the crowd, and the young men and the paper cup on the ground. She had done it. She had actually done it. And now she was terrified of what would happen next. The silence lasted for what felt like forever. Elena stood there with her heart racing and her hands trembling at her sides, waiting for the laughter to start. Again, she was sure they were going to mock her even more now. Sure they were going to tell her how terrible she sounded and how foolish she looked trying to sing in her dirty clothes with her messy hair. But the laughter never came. Instead, something else happened, something Elena had not experienced in so many years that she had forgotten what it felt like. A woman in the front of the crowd started clapping. It was slow at first, just one pair of hands coming together in the cold night air. Then another person joined in, and then another. And then suddenly, the whole plaza erupted in applause, not polite applause like you give when you feel sorry for someone. This was real applause, the kind that comes from deep inside, when you have witnessed something that moves your soul. Elena blinked in confusion as the sound washed over her. People were cheering and whistling, and she could see tears on the faces of strangers who had stopped to listen. An older gentleman in a perfectly tailored suit was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. A young couple was holding each Other like they had just heard the most romantic thing in the world. Even the security guards at the opera house door had stopped what they were doing to stare. Elena did not know what to do. She had prepared herself for humiliation and rejection, but not for this, not for acceptance, not for appreciation. Her legs felt weak, and she had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. The tall young man who had started everything was still standing there, but the arrogance had completely drained from his face. He looked pale and confused, like someone had just told him everything he believed about the world was wrong. His friends were equally stunned, and one of them had actually put down his champagne glass, which was probably a first for the evening. The crowd kept growing as people came out of the opera house to see what all the commotion was about. Word was spreading fast that something incredible had just happened on the front steps. Elena heard fragments of conversation as people whispered to each other. "Did you hear that voice? Who is she? Where did she come from?" She felt overwhelmed by all the attention after years of being invisible. Part of her wanted to grab her blanket and her cup and disappear into the night before anyone could ask her any questions, but her legs would not move and her voice would not work, and all she could do was stand there as the world shifted around her. Then the crowd parted, and a woman walked through. She was maybe 60 years old, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant style and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a deep blue dress that moved like water when she walked, and there was something about her presence that made people step aside without being asked. Elena recognized her immediately, even though they had never met. This was Marta Vidal, the director of the Valencia Opera House. Elena had seen her picture in newspapers and magazines back when she still followed the opera world. Marta was a legend in Spanish music circles and had discovered some of the greatest voices of the past 3 decades. And now she was walking directly toward Elena with an expression that was impossible to read. The crowd went quiet again as Marta stopped in front of the homeless woman who had just brought a plaza full of wealthy strangers to tears. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Marta studied Elena with those sharp eyes, taking in the worn clothes and the weathered face and the paper cup that had been knocked over during all the excitement. Then she did something that surprised everyone watching. She reached out and took both of Elena's hands in her own. "Your voice," she said softly. "I know that voice." Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. "I have not heard a mezzo-soprano with that quality in years," Marta continued, "and trust me, I have heard them all." She squeezed Elena's hands gently. "Who are you, and where have you been hiding?" The question hung in the air between them. Elena opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. How could she explain 15 years of loss and betrayal and homelessness in a single sentence? How could she tell this elegant woman that she used to be someone worth knowing? She started and then stopped. "I used to sing," she finally managed in a voice barely above a whisper. Marta nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she already suspected. Did she repeat it? "And what happened?" Elena shook her head as tears finally began to fall down her cheeks. "Life happened," she said simply. Marta was quiet for a moment, and then she turned to look at the tall young man who was still standing nearby, looking like he wished the ground would swallow him whole. "You," she said in a voice that carried authority, "you started this, did you not?" The young man swallowed hard and nodded. "Then I suppose I should thank you," Marta said with a hint of a smile, "because you just helped me discover something quite remarkable." She turned back to Elena, and her expression softened. "I do not know your story yet, but I would very much like to hear it." She glanced at the opera house behind them. "It is warm inside, and there is food, and I imagine you could use both. Would you come with me?" Elena stared at her in disbelief. Was this actually happening? Was the director of the Valencia Opera House really inviting her inside? She looked down at her clothes and felt a wave of shame wash over Harry. "Cannot go in there," she said, gesturing at herself. "Look at me." Marta tilted her head and smiled. "I'm looking at you," she replied, "and I see a woman with an extraordinary gift. The clothes do not matter. The building does not care what you are wearing, and neither do I," she offered. Elena, her arm like they were old friends about to take a stroll. "Please," she said. "I insist." Elena hesitated for just a moment longer. She thought about all the nights she had sat outside this building listening to muffled music through the wall. She thought about how many times she had dreamed of walking through those golden doors again, and now someone was offering her the chance. She reached out and took Marta's arm. The crowd parted as the two women walked toward the entrance of the opera house. Elena could hear people whispering and see phones still recording, but none of that seemed to matter anymore. For the first time in 15 years, she was walking towards something instead of running away from everything. The security guards held the doors open without a word, and warm air rushed out to greet them. Elena stepped inside and stopped breathing for a moment. Everything was exactly as she remembered: the crystal chandeliers and the red velvet curtains and the marble floors that had been polished until they shone like mirrors. The smell of expensive perfume and fresh flowers filled her nose, and somewhere in the distance she could hear an orchestra tuning their instruments. It was like stepping back in time, like walking into a dream she had given up on years ago. Marta guided her through the crowd of gala guests who stared openly at the homeless woman being escorted by the opera director. Elena kept her eyes forward and tried not to think about what she must look like to all these beautiful people in their beautiful clothes. They entered a private room off the main hall, and Marta closed the door behind them. The noise of the party faded to a distant murmur, and suddenly it was just the two of them. Marta gestured to a comfortable chair, and Elena sank into it gratefully. Her legs were still shaking, and she was not sure how much longer they would have held her. A server appeared with a tray of food and hot tea, and Elena had to stop herself from grabbing everything at once. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. "Take your time," Marta said, settling into a chair across from her. "There is no rush." Elena took a sip of tea and felt warmth spread through her body. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of this." Marta waved her hand dismissively. "Though not thank me yet," she said. "We are just getting started." She leaned forward with genuine curiosity in her eyes. "Now tell me everything. Who are you really, and how did you end up outside my opera house?" With a voice that could break hearts, Elena set down her teacup and took a deep breath. It was a long story full of pain and regret, and she was not sure she was ready to tell it, but something about Marta made her feel safe. Something about this moment made her feel like maybe, just maybe, her story was not over yet. So she began to talk, and for the first time in 15 years, someone actually listened. Elena talked for almost 2 hours that night. She told Marta everything from the very beginning. She spoke about her childhood in a small village where her mother first discovered her voice while washing dishes in their tiny kitchen. She described the years of sacrifice and hard work, and how her mother had taken extra jobs just to pay for singing lessons. She shared the joy of her first real performance and the terror and excitement of moving to Madrid to pursue her dreams. And then she told Marta about the darkness that came after: cancer that stole her mother, and the manager who stole everything else, the depression that swallowed her whole, and the slow, terrible slide into homelessness. Marta listened without interrupting. She did not offer pity or empty words of comfort. She simply sat there and gave Elena the space to tell her story in her own way. When Elena finally finished, she felt emptied out in a way that was almost peaceful. She had been carrying this weight for so long, and sharing it with someone who actually cared felt like setting down a burden she had forgotten she was holding. Marta was quiet for a long moment after Elena stopped talking. Then she stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the plaza where Elena had been sitting just hours before. "I have been in this business for 40 years, she said, without turning around, "and I have heard thousands of voices. Some were good, and some were great, and a very few were truly extraordinary." She turned to face Elena. "Yours is one of the extraordinary ones, even after everything you have been through. I can hear it tonight. The gift is still there." Elena shook her head slowly. That was just one song, she said. And I barely made it through. My voice is not what it used to be. Nothing about me is what it used to be. Marta smiled and walked back to sit across from her. Of course, it is not the same, she agreed. You have lived and you have suffered and you have survived. That changes a voice, but it does not destroy it. She leaned forward with intensity in her eyes. What I heard tonight was not a perfect voice, but it was a true voice, and that is much more rare and much more valuable. Elena did not know what to say. She had spent so many years believing she was worthless that hearing someone speak about her gift felt almost painful, like blood rushing back into a limb that had been numb for too long. Marta seemed to understand her silence. I am not going to pretend this will be easy, she said. Your voice needs work and your body needs care and your spirit needs healing. But I believe you can perform again if you want to. The words hung in the air between them. Perform again. Elena had not allowed herself to even think about that possibility in over a decade. It seemed as impossible as flying to the moon. I would not even know where to start, she whispered. Marta stood up and offered her hand. You start by getting some rest and some food and some proper shelter. Everything else comes after. That night, Elena slept in a real bed for the first time in 3 years. Marta had arranged for her to stay at a small hotel near the opera house and had promised to come back in the morning to talk more about the future. Elena lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling and wondering if this was all some kind of dream. She kept expecting to wake up on the cold pavement with nothing but her thin blanket and her paper cup. But morning came and she was still in the soft bed, and there was hot water for a shower and clean towels that smelled like lavender. She stood under the water until it ran cold and cried tears. She did not even know she had left. When Marta arrived later that morning, she brought news that changed everything. That video from last night, she said, setting her phone on the table. It has been viewed over 2 million times. Lena stared at her in confusion. What video? Someone in the crowd recorded your performance and posted it online, Marta explained, and it spread everywhere. She turned the phone so Elena could see the screen. There she was in her dirty coat with her gray hair wild around her face, singing with her eyes closed while strangers watched in amazement. The comments were overwhelming. People from all over the world were writing about how her voice had moved them to tears. Journalists were asking who she was and what her story was. The video had been shared by famous singers and musicians who wanted to know more about the mysterious homeless woman with the opera voice. Elena felt dizzy looking at all of it. This is too much, she said, pushing the phone away. I do not want this kind of attention. Marta nodded sympathetically. I understand, and we can control how much of your story gets told. But this attention could also be an opportunity. She paused to let that sink in. The charity gala last night raised money for homeless shelters in Valencia. What if we organized a special concert with you as the featured performer? All the proceeds could go to helping people who are living on the streets, just like you. Elena looked up sharply. You want me to perform on that stage in front of all those people? I want to give you the chance, Marta corrected gently. The choice is yours. Over the next few days, Elena thought about nothing else. The fear was overwhelming, and every time she imagined standing on that stage, she felt like she might be sick. But there was something else to a tiny spark of hope that refused to go out no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. She thought about all the nights she had spent outside the opera house, listening to music through the walls. She thought about her mother, who had believed in her voice before anyone else. She thought about the people living on the streets right now who might be helped if she found the courage to try. On the 4th day, she called Marta and said yes. The next 2 months were the hardest of Elena's life, but also the most meaningful. Marta connected her with a vocal coach named Teresa, who specialized in helping singers recover their voices after long breaks. Teresa was tough and demanding and pushed Elena harder than anyone had pushed her in years, but she was also kind and patient and never made Elena feel ashamed of how much work she needed. They Started with the basics, breathing exercises and gentle scales, and learning to trust her body again after so many years of neglect. Elena's voice cracked and wavered, and sometimes disappeared entirely in the middle of a phrase. There were days when she wanted to give up and tell everyone she had made a terrible mistake, but Teresa would not let her quit. Every voice has a story, she told Elena one afternoon when they were both frustrated after a difficult session. Your story is just more interesting than most. Slowly, things began to change. Elena moved into transitional housing arranged by a local charity that had seen the viral video. She had regular meals and medical care, and for the first time in years, she started to feel like a human being again. Weight she had lost on the streets began to come back. The persistent cough that had plagued her for years finally cleared up. Her voice? Oh, her voice. It was not the same instrument she had played in her 20s. That voice was gone forever, lost to time and hardship and silence. But something new was emerging in its place, a voice that carried the weight of everything she had survived, a voice that was deeper and richer and more emotionally complex than anything she had produced before. Teresa called it a resurrection voice, a voice that had died and come back transformed. The concert was scheduled for December, and as the date approached, Elena felt terror and excitement battling inside her chest. Tickets sold out within hours of going on sale. The story of the homeless woman who sang outside the opera house had captured hearts across Spain, and people were flying in from other countries just to see her perform. Elena could not believe any of it was real. The night before the concert, she stood alone on the empty stage of the Valencia Opera House. The seats stretched out before her, row after row of red velvet, waiting to be filled with strangers who wanted to hear her sing. She thought about the young woman she used to be, who had dreamed of moments like this, and she thought about the broken woman she had become, who had given up on everything, including herself. Somehow, both of those people had led her here to this stage, and this moment, and this impossible second chance. She closed her eyes and hummed a few bars of "O Mio Babino Caro," the same song that had started everything on that cold October night. Her voice echoed through the empty hall, and for just a moment she could swear she felt her mother standing beside her. Tomorrow, she would face her fears and sing for thousands of people. Tomorrow she would find out if her resurrection was real, but tonight she just stood in the silence and let herself believe that miracles might actually exist. The morning of the concert, Elena woke up before sunrise and could not go back to sleep. Her stomach was tight with nerves, and her hands would not stop shaking no matter how many deep breaths she took. She stood by the window of her small apartment and watched the sky slowly change from black to purple to pink. In 12 hours she would be standing on the biggest stage of her life. The thought made her want to run away and hide somewhere no one would ever find her. But she had made a promise to herself and to Marta, and to all the people who had believed in her when she could not believe in herself. She was not going to break that promise. The day passed in a blur of preparation and last-minute rehearsals and people fussing over her hair and makeup. Elena had never experienced anything like it before. Even in her early career, she had never been the center of this much attention. A designer had created a simple black dress just for her, and when she put it on, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her in the mirror. She looked elegant and dignified, and nothing like the person who had been sitting on a cold sidewalk just 2 months ago. But inside, she still felt like that person. Still felt like she did not deserve any of this. Teresa came to see her an hour before the show. The vocal coach took one look at Elena and knew exactly what she was feeling. "You are terrified," she said matter-of-factly. Elena nodded, unable to speak. "Good," Teresa replied. "That means you care." She took Elena's hands in her own and squeezed them gently. "Listen to me. Your voice is ready, and your heart is ready. Only thing standing between you and that stage is fear, and fear is just a feeling. It cannot actually stop you unless you let it." Elena took a shaky breath and tried to let those words sink in. "What if I fail?" she whispered. "What if I get out there and my voice disappears? Then you will still be the bravest person in that building." Teresa answered without hesitation. Because you tried. She smiled and brushed a strand of hair from Elena's face. Now, go out there and show them what a resurrection sounds like. The backstage area was chaos with stagehands rushing around, and musicians warming up and people speaking into headsets. Elena stood in the wings and watched through a gap in the curtain as the audience filed into their seats. The opera house was completely full. Every single seat was taken, and there were people standing in the back who had paid just to be in the room. She spotted familiar faces in the crowd. Marta was sitting in the front row next to the mayor of Valencia and several other important-looking people. Teresa was a few rows back, wiping her eyes already, even though nothing had happened yet. And then Elena saw someone else, someone she had not expected. The tall young man who had mocked her that night in October was sitting near the middle of the theater. He was alone, and he looked nervous, and he kept glancing toward the stage like he was waiting for something. Elena felt a strange mix of emotions seeing him there. Part of her was angry that he had come after what he had done, but another part of her understood that people could change. She had changed more in the past 2 months than she had in the past 15 years. Maybe he deserved the chance to change too. The lights in the theater began to dim, and the audience grew quiet. Elena felt her heart pounding so hard. She was sure everyone around her could hear it. This was it. There was no going back now. Marta walked onto the stage to introduce the evening, and the audience applauded warmly. She spoke about the charity they were supporting and the shelters that would benefit from tonight proceeds, and then she told Elena's story. Not all of it, because some things were too personal to share with strangers, but enough for people to understand what they were about to witness. She talked about finding Elena outside the opera house and hearing a voice that stopped her in her tracks. She talked about the journey of the past 2 months and how hard Elena had worked to get to this moment. And she talked about second chances and how sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most broken places. By the time Marta finished, there were tears streaming down faces throughout the audience, and Elena had not even sung a note yet. Please welcome to the stage, Marta said, her voice thick with emotion, a woman who taught me that it is never too late to find your voice again. The applause started before Elena even stepped into the light. She walked onto the stage on legs that felt like they might collapse at any moment. The spotlight was warm on her face and so bright that she could barely see the audience, but she could hear them. She could hear thousands of people rising to their feet and clapping for her before she had done anything to earn it. They were applauding her courage just for showing up, just for trying. Elena stood at the center of the stage and waited for the noise to die down. The silence that followed was so complete, she could hear her own breathing. She looked out at the sea of faces, and for one terrible moment, her mind went completely blank. She could not remember the words to any song. She could not remember why she was here. She could not remember anything except the fear that was threatening to swallow her whole. And then she thought about her mother. She thought about the woman who had dropped a plate in shock when she first heard her 6-year-old daughter singing. The woman who had worked 3 jobs and never complained. The woman who had believed in Elena's voice when it was just a whisper of potential. Her mother was gone, but her love was still here. Elena could feel it wrapped around her like a warm blanket. She closed her eyes and took a breath from deep in her belly, and she began to sing. First song was O mio babino caro, the same aria that had started everything. Her voice wavered on the opening notes, and she heard a few people in the audience gasp, but she did not stop. She pushed through the fear and the doubt, and somewhere around the middle of the song, her voice found its footing. The wobble disappeared, and what emerged was something raw and powerful and heartbreakingly beautiful. She sang about love and loss and longing, and every person in that theater heard their own story in her words. When the last note faded away, the silence lasted for 3 full seconds. Then, audience erupted. The applause was deafening, and people were on their feet, and Elena could see tears on faces throughout the theater. She had done it. She had actually done it. But she was not finished yet. The second song was stronger and more confident. Elena could feel herself settling into the music like coming home after a long journey. Her voice filled every corner of the opera house, and she knew that her mother would have been proud by the time she reached her final song. She was no longer afraid. She had chosen Nessun Dorma for her finale. It was traditionally sung by men, but Elena had worked with Teresa to adapt it for her voice. The bewerkt it for her voice. The beheard mess. It was traditionally sung by men, but Elena had worked with Teresa to adapt it for her voice. The aria was about triumph over darkness and refusing to give up hope. It was about believing that dawn would come. Even in the longest night, Elena poured everything she had into that song. All the pain of the past 15 years and all the hope of the past 2 months. All the loneliness and the shame and the tiny spark that had refused to die even when everything else was gone. The final note rang out through the theater and seemed to hang in the air forever, and then the world exploded. The standing ovation lasted for 7 minutes. People were cheering and crying and hugging strangers next to them. Elena stood on the stage and let the sound wash over her like a wave. She was crying too, but they were not sad tears. They were the tears of someone who had finally found their way back to themselves. After the concert, there was a reception, and Elena was surrounded by people who wanted to congratulate her, but there was one conversation she needed to have first. She spotted the tall young man standing alone near the back of the room. He looked like he was trying to decide whether to approach her or leave. Elena made the decision for him and walked over. He looked terrified when he saw her coming. I wanted to say he started and then stopped, unable to find the words. "I know," Elena said gently. He shook his head, and she could see tears forming in his eyes. That night was cruel, and I have thought about it every day since I was drunk and stupid, and I had no idea what you had been through. He looked down at his shoes. "I am so sorry." Elena studied him for a long moment. This young man who had humiliated her in front of strangers. This young man whose mockery had somehow led to everything that followed. "I forgive you," she said, and meant I've looked up in surprise. You. Elena nodded. "You could not see me that night because I had made myself invisible, but you accidentally gave me a reason to be seen again." She smiled softly. "Thank you." The young man stared at her like she had just spoken in a foreign language. Then he started to cry in earnest, and Elena found herself hugging this stranger who had changed her life in ways neither of them could have predicted. Elena never became an international superstar. She did not want that kind of life anymore. Instead, she used the money and attention from the concert to start a music program for homeless people. In Valencia, she taught them that their voices mattered even when the world told them they were worthless. She taught them that it was never too late to sing again. When journalists asked what she wanted people to learn from her story, she always gave the same answer. They laughed because they could not see me. She would say, "But that night, I finally let myself be seen." Sometimes being seen is the first step to being saved. 20 years later, Elena was still teaching and still singing and still believing in second chances. Her voice was older now, and she could not hit the high notes like she used to, but it was still beautiful. It was still true, and every time she opened her mouth to sing, she thought about her mother and the plate that dropped in a tiny kitchen so many years ago. That was where her story began, and she had finally learned that stories do not have to end the way you expect them to. Sometimes the most broken chapters lead to the most beautiful conclusions. Sometimes the people who laugh at you end up changing your life. And sometimes a woman with nothing left to lose discovers that she had everything she needed. All along, she just had to find the courage to let the world hear it.